Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to the start of Area Study 2, the domestic macroeconomic goals for the government. We're going to be starting out with looking at economic activity, as before we go into any goals, we start with economic activity, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and then kind of flow into the goals. If you're at part of my school, it's going to be looking at economic activity, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and circular flow model, and then the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth for the first part of this outcome. And then the second half, we'll be looking at full employment and low inflation. It's going in a little bit different order to the study design, but I find it flows better because this economic activity stuff flows perfectly into economic growth. And you kind of already done economic growth last year, so you've got a bit of a basis for it. So what we're looking at today is the level of economic activity and the business cycle. So economic activity simply refers to the general pace or speed at which production and spending is occurring nationally. So it tends to refer to the individual actions of individuals, firms, governments that help generate the production of goods and services, employment and income. We tend to talk about it in terms of part of it when we talk about economic growth, we talk about production, income and expenditure all flowing into one another and all being relatively equal, essentially because for production to occur, they need labor and they pay an income for that labor. And then that income is turned into expenditure as we spend it on goods and services. That expenditure creates all demand for goods and services, which leads back to production. So if any of those things start to increase, they all should increase, and that leads to increased levels of economic activity. The level of economic activity is used to describe the general speed at which productive activity is occurring nationally. So it's basically the speed in which production is occurring. So two main reasons economic activity impacts our living standards. Society can only satisfy growing needs and wants through increased production. So as population grows, as our needs and wants grow, we can only satisfy that through increased production. And higher levels of economic activity are not sustainable in the long term due to the fact we have limited non-renewable resources, e.g. things like coal. We don't have enough coal forever, therefore we can't just have insanely high levels of economic activity in the short term. Then we've got the business cycle. So the business cycle, I've just got to fix up a couple of things on this picture because when you get pictures from Google, they're not always the most useful, even though they've got some things that are useful. So we need these down points to be contraction. The rest of it's good. So the business cycle refers to the wave-like up and downs in a nation's level of production or economic activity. Things move up and down based on the overall level of economic activity. And basically what we're hoping is that over time, the graph's going to really match this dotted line along the middle here. And what we call that is the level of domestic economic stability. We're hoping that these peaks and the troughs balance out to those points. And what the government essentially is trying to do by manipulating their budget, what the RBA is trying to do by manipulating interest rates, is they're trying to minimize the size of these peaks and troughs to keep them as close to that long-term trend line or domestic economic stability as possible. So it's really important to know kind of what point we're at in the business cycle to kind of predict what the government is going to do. So if you're looking at Australia at the moment, we're really kind of like in the trough phase and kind of trying to move out of it because we're recovering fairly well. Well, we were recovering fairly well from the pandemic. Now we're having little outbreaks that are causing a bit more panic, but businesses are starting to get more confident and we're moving into that kind of expansion phase. And so what each of these phases mean is that the expansion or recovery phase, which is when it starts moving up. So if we should draw the business cycle briefly over on the side here. So if we draw a dodgy business cycle, that curve was pretty sweet for me just drawing it freehand. And so the expansion phase is whenever we're moving up from that bottom point. So that's usually signaled by rising GDP growth, falling unemployment, and inflation gradually rising. If you haven't come across inflation before, inflation is prices rising over time. In the peak or boom phase, so a peak or boom is at these top points up here. A peak or boom is where unemployment reaches its lowest levels, production is really high, GDP is really high, and inflation is at a really high rate. And so partly this ends up managing itself, that when unemployment's at its lowest level, means spending's really high, means we run into shortages and inflation starts being high and prices start rising. And when prices start to rise too much, people start slowing down their spending and we actually start moving into the next phase, which is a contraction or slowdown. So in a contraction or slowdown, GDP starts to slow, so production starts to fall or increase at a lower rate. So in severe cases, production goes negative, which happened last year due to the pandemic. Most of the time, it just means we're growing at a slower rate. So GDP might still be increasing, just at a smaller percentage than before. Then after a time lag, unemployment will rise and inflation starts to ease as production falls and businesses start lowering prices to get rid of excess stock or just not increasing their prices. Then the final point we've got is the trough or recession stage. So that trough stage is when we are reaching our lowest point of economic growth. Unemployment rises to really high levels, and if we have negative output for 2 consecutive quarters, we call that a recession. So if we have negative GDP growth, so for example, last year we had negative 6.3% and then negative 3 point something percent, we end up in a recession, which is the first time that happened in a very, very long time. So if we are in a negative rate of GDP growth for 2 consecutive quarters, we are seen to be in a recession. Then, so the ideal level of economic activity, we call that domestic economic stability. And what that is when we are achieving the 3 economic goals simultaneously. So that's where there is low inflation, a solid and sustainable rate of GDP, and low unemployment, which is usually about 4.5%. This is basically the government achieving all their goals. So by the end of this topic, you'll know them as inflation being 2 to 3% on average over time. You'll know GDP growth rate as 3 to 3.5%. And unemployment as about 4.5%. And you'll know those really well. You're going to be obsessed with those numbers, hopefully, over a little bit of time. And then lastly, in terms of long-term trends for economic activity, so over time, the rises in economic activity should outweigh the falls. So the average growth trend is going upwards on the business cycle. Why do we need that to happen? Well, over time, population's increasing, so clearly we need to have more, and society's needs and wants are increasing as well. So a country's productive capacity controls the level of growth they can have sustainably over time. Essentially what that means is the resources that they have and the efficiency in which they use them. And so, especially in Australia, we have a limited amount of resources left. We've had to start looking at ways to more efficiently use our production or use our resources in a smarter way to maximize our output and increase that productive capacity. So productive capacity is the potential level of a national production of goods and services, which is dictated by the quantity and efficiency of a nation's resources, and this determines the sustainable rate of economic growth in the long term. There's a reason why China can have a GDP growth rate of 10%, while Africa might only have a growth rate of 1%. It's all about the resources you have and the efficiency in which you can use them. We tend to aim for the goal of 3 to 3.5% GDP growth per annum because that's what we can sustainably do with the resources that we have. That's essentially it for this just brief overview of economic activity. It means that in the next lesson, we'll be looking at the 4-sector circular flow model, or the 5-sector circular flow model, excuse me, which we're going to go through in detail. There's already a video for that, so you'll be seeing that very, very soon. We get to see my terribly drawn picture of the model where I try to do it freehand. Other than that, if you want any other help with this topic, there's already videos for the rest of the topic. They're in a playlist on the YouTube channel if you want to check that out. I'm also going to update my website, which is www.therunningeconomy.com, to have a page where all the videos are just in a row for ease of watching. If you want help from other teachers and other students, feel free to also go to my website and check out the link to the Discord, where there's a Discord where teachers from, I think about like 7 or 8 different other schools are there willing to help students, and students willing to help other students, and a whole bunch of resources available to try and help people out. Other than that, I hope you have a wonderful day 3 of pandemic lockdown in Melbourne if you're in my class, or whatever day this is for you if you're from anywhere else. Good night. See you later. I'm working on a Sunday night. This is disgusting.